Hello, everyone, and welcome to our second Global Public Seminar in Comparative and International Education. These are joint seminars organized by the Department of Education and St. Edmund Hall at the University of Oxford. I'm Maia Chankseliani. I'm Associate Professor of Comparative and International Education. I'm the convener of these seminars. Before introducing our seminar series and our speaker, there are some brief administrative points to mention. This seminar will be recorded and will be posted online in due course. We will only record the first half of the seminar, including the presentation. We will not be recording the Q&A due to the GDPR regulations. Therefore, can I ask everyone to keep your cameras off until after the presentation? Please keep yourself muted throughout the seminar unless you have been asked to speak or to ask a question. To ask a question, use the chat function and write out the question you wish to ask. At the end of the presentation, if your question is selected, you will be invited to ask it yourself directly. When you are invited, please unmute yourself, switch on your video, and state your name and where you are from. We have 4 more seminars planned for this summer. In the next few moments, I will share a link in the chat to the webpage where you can read about the forthcoming seminars and book your place. Now the best part comes. Let me introduce our speaker. Our speaker today is Professor Miri Yemini. Miri is based at the School of Education at Tel Aviv University. She teaches graduate and undergraduate modules in education, including internationalization in education, education and globalization, entrepreneurship in education, and project management in schools. Miri serves as a co-chair of the UNESCO Chair for Technology and Internationalization in Education. Miri's research interests include globalization of and in education, global citizenship education, internationalization, intermediaries in education, and the global middle class. Recently, Miri was awarded with Professor Dr. Nina Kolleck by the Max Planck Foundation the award for research cooperation and high excellence in science to develop research in the field of school-NGO interactions. This year, Miri Yemini secured funding from Israeli Science Foundation for her project on education trajectories of global middle-class families. And this is the topic that she will be presenting today. I will now stop and pass it over to Miri. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Maya, for inviting me, and thank you all of you for coming here. Just a brief announcement before I start. I'm located now in Tel Aviv, so in case the siren will be activated, I will have to move to a safety room, which is just 5 meters away. We will have to stop the talk for a couple of minutes, but I hope we won't be interrupted at this time. So be with me. I'll share my screen now and we will be able to start. Just a second. Sorry. Okay, here we go. So my talk today will focus on global middle class. And I will talk about this group of people, which I will describe and define soon in terms of the education domain. My research interests basically combine issues of globalization and internationalization of education, and the major part in this discourse is how parents and schooling procedures are organized in these matters of the interaction between the global and local dimensions. So as for the global middle class, I would like to start with a very common definition by Bol and Nikita from 2014, talking about the managers and professionals and their families who move around the globe. They are basically usually middle-range employees of multinational corporations. They usually have the they're quite privileged part of the middle class. And what is interesting about them is their continuous mobility. This mobility is actually a very prominent part in their lives, and it affects the way they perceive themselves, their family life, their habits, their preferences in education. And since this group is growing in the world, and in terms of the diversity of the people who are practicing this kind of lifestyle, it is interesting to see how they behave in their parenting and education strategies. So this is actually a spin-off from my larger research project concerning global citizenship education, where we looked into how schools incorporate global aspects of education and global citizenship education and environmentally related education in particular. But then we came to ask, what about the ideas of mobility and how these can be incorporated within this research agenda? And what I want to show you today is just some small bits of research in this field, in order to discuss much broader issues of privilege, of equality, of mobility, and basically issues that are of interest for comparative education scholar and sociologist of education. So just a little bit more of the definitions. What is interesting about the global middle class is that, there are three words: global, middle, and class. So the part of the middle, meaning these people are actually located between the elites and the working class. They have very similar qualifications and characteristics as other middle class families, except the fact that they are constantly mobile, meaning they have moved. In our definition, in our research settings, we looked into families that moved at least twice with their children, with their families, for a period as long as at least 1 year. Um, they usually hold middle management positions in these corporations. So depending on the country, for example, in Hong Kong, we looked into families where parents were working in financial industry, and in London it was more about a high-tech industry. But basically these are multinational corporations that move people from place to place according to the needs of these corporations. Additional issue that is worth mentioning here, that these families have to make many choices. So the very first basic choice is whether to move or not. Usually one of the parents can be defined as part of this global middle class. Sometimes these are two parents together. But basically the first choice that they have to make is whether to move or not. Then they have to make choices, many choices about the education of their children, which school to choose, which activities to participate, how to facilitate this constant moving between places, between education systems, between societies. And we believe that these choices are very important in order to understand how society works and how education systems are being shaped with and by this group of people. Additional topic, perhaps term that is worth noting here, is that most of these families usually are located in what we call global cities, which are large cosmopolitan cities located in central places in terms of financial transactions. And usually the moves are between these different locations, when we could trace um, sort of different parts of the world that are more common in these moves and other parts that are less common. You can see here some examples of the cities that we have been focusing on. What is interesting to say about this, that once one can assume that these moves would basically expose these families to different environments and to very different languages and cultural preferences. We must say that this is not entirely true, because the global cities usually are very heterogeneous and have some sort of cosmopolitan nature, meaning, for example, they usually have diasporic communities related to the home nations of these families, and there are usually many educational choices to make within the cities. There is a local system, sometimes there are international schools, but also schools from the home country of these families that sometimes can be available. In terms of numbers, um, this is an estimation for the next year, according to some data that were incorporated in this large research report by some corporate companies who are working with expats and with globally mobile professionals. Um, since this was published last year, obviously the world experienced a global pandemic, and um, many of these movements were halted and postponed, perhaps. And we will have to see what is going to be the fate of this population. But from what we see in our research following social networks, and some data that we have, we can see that even if several moves were postponed, most of them actually took place sometimes when part of the family moves and then the other part joined them. But basically, we can think about 70 million people around the world moving between different places and have quite few things in common. So, three things that I would like us to remember about this group of people. First, their frequent mobility that I already mentioned. Another one is the sense of belonging. We know that it is very common in the theoretical literature in the field to talk about cosmopolitan nature, citizens of the world kind of a thing, where the assumption is that these frequent moves might foster a development of a world or global citizenship type of belonging. But we can see that actually from empirical research that these families develop quite strong ties with their nation, um, and we see that the sense of belonging is also very important in their education choices and the way they do practice parenting. And one last thing is about the reproduction strategies that these families employ. As I said, we are talking about middle class families, usually upper middle class. Therefore, we can assume that in Bordesian terms, they work in reproducing their privilege. However, in terms of what is known about reproduction strategies of this group of the middle class comparing to working class, for example, we know that the idea, the major anchoring of the state, its institutions, its social networks that parents have within their nation state is very important for this type of reproduction to occur. And the question is, what happens to these middle class families that are used to work and live middle class lives when they move from place to place? And on one hand, they are very privileged in many ways, but on the other hand, they basically in each move they lose some sense of their privilege, some sense, some strategies that they usually would employ if they were located in their nation state. Therefore, this is an interesting empirical and theoretical question. Um, so I would like to share with you some of the theoretical ideas that we used in order to understand and to interpret our data, and then I'll show you a couple of examples from the data that were collected during this research. So one way to look into this population is basically, we collected data in five global cities, including Tel Aviv and London, Copenhagen, Hong Kong, and Buenos Aires. But we tried not to compare in the country-based matter of these families. So this is not a comparative study in that sense. First of all, because these families moved quite a lot. So when we compare people that are located in Hong Kong, for example, to people who are located in London, actually these are Germans that moved then to Mexico and now they're located in Hong Kong and vice versa. Therefore, we employed the assumption of methodological nationalism and try to find other ways to look into this combined sample where the world is actually our unit of analysis, using Ulrich Beck's typology in that sense. Another thing that was really important is the topic that I mentioned earlier about the way that middle class assume to reproduce their privilege within the education system and in this parenting work that mothers and families perform in order to achieve and sustain advantage. And here again we looked into the way that Annette Leroux used to understand middle class strategies of concerted cultivation and natural growth, and we try to adapt this framework to the situation where there is no anchor and no ties to the homeland or to the nation state where these families are located, and each time when they changed location they had to perform class over and over again, and we try to basically use this framework without standing putting too much weight on the role of the nation state in that sense. Additional theory that was very useful for us is of Ackerman and Becker concerning the boundary crossing and boundary objects, which was very useful for us. We saw that these moves are only available when families are investing time and energy in preparing their children for these moves. Therefore, we found that certain objects, certain ideas, certain rituals were very useful for these families. They usually were connected to the homeland of one or both of the parents, and they were employed in these moves to allow children to adapt to the new situation. For example, in our sample, there were quite few religious families, and these families used religion as this boundary object that allowed them to move and to still have a solid background that connects them and their children to the broader world. What was interesting concerning these objects and these rituals that these families had is the notion of nostalgia. And in that I mean that in many interviews that were performed, we actually saw how parents were educating their children towards some sort of ideal type of nation state that they left behind, but actually this nation state is very different 20 years from now, after this family moved so many times. This was, for example, a parent with families that moved from the socialist countries to begin with, and they moved again and again, and basically some of the rituals that were running in these families were concerned with the socialist past of their home country, while the country already totally transformed. And basically sometimes they learned the language that was not useful anymore in the home country, which was very interesting. So basically it's not about only creating links to the home nation, but it's about creating links to the home nation as it was left at the beginning, basically. These are the theories that we found quite useful for us to understand and to play with our data. And now I would like to show you some examples. So, for example, as the first topic, I mentioned that there were many choices to make in each of this move, and one of the obvious one concerning the education was the school choice. Um, so you can read the citations here, but just to show you the larger picture in that sense, we could see a clear trajectory of a school choice that basically was transformed within each of the moves. So, in general, the strategies of the global professionals in terms of school choice started with staying close to what is known, and therefore, their first move, they usually chose a school that was related to their home country. So, if these were French family that relocated to Argentina, they continue to sending their children to the French lycée in order to remain to basically recreate the links with the language and the home nation in the first move. Later on, in the second move, these families actually chose to play the national game. Therefore, in the next moves, they chose the system that was most suitable and competitive academically. They did the research, they integrated into local social networks, and they basically played the game of the local middle classes. What we can see with people who went back home, and not all of them eventually, or at the stage that we interviewed them, went back home, we could see that while once they were home, they tried again, as in the first move, to reconnect with the places that basically were given them some sort of advantage for the future, for the imagined future of their children. Um, in terms of travel, which is short-term travel, that would be better definition for that. In this part of the study, we actually compared the way that global middle-class families travel for short-term trips comparing to middle-class and working-class families. It is an interesting comparison again in this broader discussion whether global middle class is actually a class of its own or just a mobile segment of the middle class. And perhaps with the importance and prominence of travel in the modern life, I know that after this COVID year, um, it's somehow strange to talk about international travel, but this data were collected before that. So just to say a few words about it, we found that all the families in our sample, including working and middle class families, used travel for the purposes of education. So travel was not only going away for holidays or visit the family, or for short study trip. It was always involved a very intense sort of parenting that was important for the parents. It was part of their, definitely part of their parenting agenda. But what we saw that for working class, and again we had sort of a bias here, since most of our working class families were also families of migrants, or of people who basically created diasporic communities in the place of their living. Mostly they went back home to visit their families, but nevertheless they used travels to open up the world, to discuss different differences with their children, and to equip them for future travel. Um, and middle class, I don't want to go into small differences here, but they basically acted the same. There were obviously more travel, it was more prominent in their life, it was more standard in a sense. But nevertheless, it was used both to learn about themselves, about these families, and about the world. While what we saw with the global middle class families is a total normalization of travel. It was actually not something meaningful or different. It was part of their lives, and the children were given here the agency, sometimes even to choose the locations, to take part in the planning process, and to really be part of, be an active part, a agentic part of the whole travel. What is interesting to see that if we compare the length of time stayed abroad for these short-term travels, then we would say that global middle class families actually stayed quite longer in each of the locations that were chosen, comparing to middle class and working class. So they weren't used to jump from location to location, and once they went abroad for a short trip, they usually stayed in one place. But obviously this study is not quantitative in its nature, so I'm not sure that we can generalize these findings. Perhaps I already mentioned religion. I was asked to give plenty of time for Q&A, so I will show you one last part of the finding, and then I'll move to the conclusion. So about this idea of boundary crossing, how basically this is a major sociological type of question. How once you remove the institutions and social networks and social ties of the nation state, how these families are actually able to sustain their and reproduce their advantage. And as I already mentioned at the beginning, we use this notion of boundary crossing and boundary objects as a useful way to understand how these crossings are possible. And each of these families, we were actually able to locate and identify these different objects, for example, sustaining the homeland language, for example, using different rituals, whether they're religious or family rituals, that were sustained in each of the travels. So there was one family that they were very environmentally aware. So each location that they came, they first thing first were working on find out where you recycle and how you can be environmentally friendly, and what kind of new rituals you can include into whether your diet or your habits. So we could locate for each of these rituals, and these objects were quite unique and perhaps awkward in a sense, but each of the families had at least one such an object that was very um, carefully managed by the usually the mothers of these families, and it was this link that allowed them to move from place to place. And as I showed you, for example, for school choice, it was process where first you choose something that is close to your homeland, and then you are able to enter the sort of the new society in the next move, and here as well. So each time they added habit on habit, and eventually this is how the crossing was enabled. Why this research is important? So, firstly, in terms of theoretically speaking, I would say it's quite important to understand whether these people um, that whether mobility actually is such an important part of their lives that actually creates a class of its own. Um, and we try to understand what kind of things these people have in common and how they're different perhaps from their moored or immobile peers of the middle class from their country or other countries. And we're still in the process of looking into this topic. So I don't have an answer to that yet. It's also important to understand the research gap in this area. Mobility studies are usually concerned with less privileged migration, which is very important. But sometimes it's also quite interesting and important to understand how privileged mobility is occurring, and it also enriches the way we understand mobility, but it also allows us to understand some substantial things about social reproduction. And we definitely found some very interesting ideas here to complement Annette Laroux's framework, for example, of concerted cultivation. And obviously, it's important in terms of the practice and how governments should be prepared for this growing group of people, what kind of integration tools should be proposed. And we saw that these people not necessarily go and choose international schools or religious schools or Jewish schools or whatever. So the system itself, the national education systems, are actually being transformed as a result, and it's important to understand how and why, and we are working quite hard on this direction now, and we have very interesting findings. So perhaps, Maya, next year I will be able to tell a little bit about that. And So to conclude, we started with definitions of the global middle class. We talked about mobility and belonging and social reproduction, which are their main characteristics. We showed a little bit about religion, school choice, and I tried to give you some ideas about where this research can go next. I would like to thank my great collaborators and my generous funders. These are some of the publications from this project, and you can access this later on. And I would like to thank you all for listening. You can find me here on this email. So I look forward to hear your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Miri.